2017.
And the presentation.
And it's a long relationship with this car. I first read about it in 1969 in Jerry Best's book when he started talking about it. And it's sort of both satisfying and odd that I would end up working for where that car is. I really wanted to restore it, so I was really disappointed when the initial report came back in what was it, 2015, that recommended against it. And the more we dug into it, it was just like there's so much would be destroyed if we were to actually do a restoration of that car. There's so many wonderful scars and mysteries that remain. The one thing we did, we replaced the platforms, obviously, and we want it to be obvious. We're not trying to fake old platforms. This is what we did. We did it primarily because there was no place to put the handrails. The other platforms were just so shot that there was nothing to anchor anything to. So what I actually imagine today is primarily answering questions, if you have any. You know, the booklet is now out. That's everything I know about the car, including a little bit about what I don't know about the car. I hope that the research continues in time. The car has a great history. It's legitimately a significant car, and that's half the reason that we didn't want to tear it apart. Is if you go look on the other side and you see the truss, and you're looking at original redwood truss that was from 1868 in Sacramento. I'm hoping that maybe in time we can get a computer model, or like a 3D model, so that you can see it in different periods and actually go inside. I would like to ultimately be able to take people into it, just because there's so many interesting things about the Clear story and the way that the V&T modernized it by destroying it, the original structure, causing it to sag. But whoever expected a car to last this long? They didn't build it with this in mind. The Central Pacific was very quick to get rid of it. They only had it for a few years, and the one thing that we're doing, everybody loves especially the kids, they like the woodpecker holes. So I got a woodpecker that we're going to put on the side of the car.
That's cool.
Some gal in Berkeley she calls herself vegan taxidermy, because it's illegal to actually do this with a real woodpecker. But one of the acorns is in the woodpecker's mouth. But that'll go on the side of the car, and it'll probably always be known as the woodpecker car, for obvious reasons. I hope that eventually, when it goes in the front building, that we take the truss out. We'll probably, if we do that and put people in it, we'll probably put a layer of plywood on the floor just laying there, because right now, if we were all in there now, most of us would actually fall through. It's fairly fragile. And that truss is holding up about a foot of sag in the middle of the car. It's an antique design. It was obsolete, and whether it's obsolete, just because the modern trusses hadn't been invented yet, or because of California's isolation, because of the Transcontinental Railroad not yet being finished, I don't know. The design is basically from the 1840s, and the other cars from that era were beginning to fail, and I'm sure that's what motivated them to come up with the inverted truss and the brace straining rod. The really cool thing about having it here is you can see examples of those other things. We have other cars that have the inverted trusses and the brace straining rods, and so you can see exactly what we're talking about. But if you look at the truss on the other side, I mean, you can see the gap where that car's been leveled. It's just opened up the truss to where the truss is doing nothing other than a place to nail the siding. What you see on the outside on this side is basically, other than the basic design, is all post the Virginian trucking, or post it leaving the Central Pacific and going to the V&T. The siding is 1912. The window shape was changed at some point fairly early on. There's a lot of the roof material is original. It just has no structural value because they cut in 4 pieces, and then
Wendell,
prayed that it stayed up.
are any of the glass panes from Central Pacific, or are they all V&T?
Well, the window shape changed.
Right.
It wasn't an arch top, so they may have taken a square. I can't remember right now this morning whether we figured out they made the window taller or shorter. There's old glass there.
Okay.
And Chris might answer something about that. But whether it's actually original, I don't know.
Okay.
Yes.
Was this car at Promontory?
This car was at Promontory. It was the Central Pacific's business car. And Crocker's the one that used it most. And he sort of maintained, shall we say, possession of it afterwards, apparently, because he's the one that's most often identified as using it. And then after Promontory, it's actually called Crocker's car. And then by the end of the year, they had hired someone else as a superintendent. He had resigned, and then they hired him back.
V&T did the arches.
And they gave the town, the new superintendent, a different car. So Crocker used this pretty much exclusively for a while until he resigned the second time. And
So this car went over the trestle to Virginia City?
yes, many times.
Many times.
From 1878 to 1938, this was in the regular train on the V&T, the summer train, as I recall.
Did it have paper in the wheels?
No, the wheels are a mystery.
Okay.
There's actually 3 reasons against restoring, and one is the lack of information. We actually know more than we thought we knew. I think part of my objective during the study that we did while we were stabilizing it was to identify specifically what we knew and the areas we didn't know. If you look at the trucks, the pedestals have V&T cast into them. So they're definitely from the V&T. The wheels themselves are FCS wheels that are dated 1922. How much of that truck is new since the Central Pacific? How much of it was rebuilt? We don't know. That's a mystery. The truck is, Kyle's the truck guy, and someday he's going to answer that question. But as far as we know, I don't know. I have no evidence that it had paper wheels, no evidence that it didn't. The one interesting thing, if you want to get your fingers dirty, it has a muley axle. A standard master car builder axle has a collar around the edge to give it lateral resistance to keep it from moving back and forth. It fits, the bearing fits inside of that collar. This does not have this. It has a stop that overhangs the end of the axle. But if you feel in there, there's no lip or collar on the end of the axle. And that's called a muley. So what? I don't know. I don't know the dates of the muley. I know it's in the car builders' dictionaries, but when did it go out of style? I don't know. In any event, the wheels that are on it are 1922. The other area that's the big unknown is on the inside, how the ceiling was treated. We have no interior photographs of this car before 1938. And there were partitions. We know where the partitions were because there's extra blocking in the roof, and we can see the scar in the wall where the partitions interfaced with the wall. But how those partitions crossed the clear story, whether there was an open transom, whether it was closed in, don't know the answer to that. We know where the lamps were that the Central Pacific had, but we don't really know what they looked like. we'd be making a lot of guesses.
Wendell?
Yes.
Regarding the partitions and the floor plan, a lot of business cars, have odd window spacings and everything, and this is very consistent. Were the partitions and the floor plan an afterthought after the exterior design?
Judging from the comments in the newspaper, this car was intended to go to New York City before they ever started building it.
I see.
It was built as basically a private car
Right.
/ business car. They didn't know any better in California. That's my guess.
Okay.
But I remember when we first put it in the shop, I remember Chris commenting on the fact that, how do we know this wasn't just a coach?
Right. Yeah.
And we don't, other than the fact that we can see the partitions, we got the photographs, and I just don't think they knew any. It was.
Well, it's always been my guess that they started off thinking they were building a new coach for the CP, and then all of a sudden, gosh, we better have a business car
Well,
to go
but
to.
it's 10 feet longer than their coaches were.
Yeah, but they were probably anticipating business, so.
I don't know. Ben, my feeling is that Ben Welsh, the guy that built this, I don't see that he had any experience building any passenger equipment from the ground up.
Okay.
Everything he had built was a kit. And I think this is just a standard kit that's lengthened by actually 7.5 feet. The window spacing, the truss design. I think if you want to know what those Central Pacific kits looked like, those first cars that they got, you look at this car and you work backwards. Why he didn't do anything fancier with the windows, I don't know. The guy that owned this after the Central Pacific turned it loose was Alfred Cohen. And he had it for just a couple of years, and then he and D.O. Mills went together and bought their own private car. Basically the same floor plan as this. It's a 6-wheel truck, a couple of feet longer, 2 bedrooms rather than 1, but it has the odd window spacings that you would expect. Things changed really fast in the late 60s and early 70s.
Right.
And that's part of what's cool about this car,
Oh, yeah.
is that it predates all of that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, have you discovered any etchings on the upper parts of any of the window glass that might indicate how old or anything like that? Because I know they did that way back when, in the old days.
In Central Pacific later, it was very common to stamp a lot number in parts.
Especially the location, because no
Yeah.
two windows were the same.
Yeah. No, there's nothing. The only thing in this car that dates itself is the design. It's the design that we see, plus the material, the redwood and the Doug fir, that's consistent with the documentary evidence we have, which links this to the Central Pacific in general and to Crocker in particular, and then the photographic evidence that it looks exactly like the car that was promontory. I don't think there's any question. I think it's remarkable that we know as much about it. But this car, after it's come to the V&T, is twice identified as Crocker's car. So to me, there's no question that this was the car that was Crocker's car. Any other questions? One of the guys that rode this car was a guy named Harvey Harkness, who I came to be sort of fascinated by. He rode with Stanford to Promontory. Turns out that most of the people that went with Stanford to Promontory were members of the Oddfellows, as was Stanford. And I think there was that social association. But Harvey Harkness was one of those guys. Harkness resigned his practice as a doctor and became Ed Crocker's private physician and went to Europe with Crocker. And from Europe he went to Suez, and Harkness was present at the opening of the Suez Canal, probably the only guy in the world that was at both the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and the opening of the Suez Canal, which sort of negated half the reason for building the Transcontinental Railroad, because they thought it was going to be a shortcut to the Orient. Any other questions?
Did, after the CP cut this loose, and it was a one-only car, did they continue to design larger coaches, instead of the 1850 design?
They did not turn this loose until they had a new director's car and a new pay car. because this was being used for both, at least
Okay.
on some occasions. Yeah, they continued to build cars, and they later built Stanford, a private car. And it's sort of interesting, when Welsh retired right around the turn of the century, the last century, there were a number of articles in the paper talking about all the things he had done. This car is never mentioned. I think this car was an experiment.
Yeah.
I think that's the way he looked at it. I'm sure he was very proud of it, but I think he got very quickly involved in Master Car Builders Association, and he long built cars out of redwood. I mean, that was fairly common for the Southern Pacific. But he figured out very quickly there was another way to do it.
Sure.
One thing, for instance, the inverted truss rod, the rod that would support the end, that's what allows a longer overhang if you're going to have a six-wheel truck. That's pretty important. That was probably one of the things that made this car obsolete, was everybody was going to six-wheel trucks very quickly. Where's Kyle? Kyle? When Kyle yesterday was talking about the eight-wheel trucks on the passenger car, I presume those had the inverted truss rod to support the overhang at the end. So that implies that the inverted overhangs were at least developed by 1869 for passenger cars.
Yeah, probably.
Otherwise, that tail end is hanging down.
Right.
And that's the one thing, you look at this car, it's been leveled in the middle because we put needle beams. And I should talk about the needle beams. But the ends still sag. Once we get it placed, we can put a jack under the ends and level it out. If you look under it, the original wooden needle beams did not go from side to side. They just go from intermediate sill to intermediate sill. The early passenger cars on the Central Pacific only had the two truss rods, the ones on the outside. And Welsh's concession to the length was to add those other two truss rods down the middle. But for some reason, he didn't put the needle beams all the way through. The car originally, well, it still has the cross tie rods that go from sill to sill. Originally, those came through on the outside so you could tighten them.
Yeah.
1912, to make the car look modern, they buried those. At that point, you couldn't tighten them anymore,
Right.
which contributed to a lateral sag. But once they put brakes on it, they cut that short needle beam even shorter.
Right.
They were messing with the car from the very beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. And you say it is going to go in the front building?
Yep, that's the plan.
Good.
You know, as a historian, I don't talk about the future.
Oh, yeah.
But that's the plan.
Okay.
That's the interpreter's job.
Any other questions?
What color was it originally?
Central Pacific straw yellow.
That's as near as we got.
Yeah.
Was yellow. If you look at the other, you can see where I've sanded the number at this end. You look at the other end, you'll see I've gone even deeper. I found no evidence before the maroon. We know the maroon was on it, on the V&T. I found no evidence of color before that.
Might
Wow.
speculate that when they converted it to a coach, were doing enough work that they stripped it.
Yep.
And how about on the interior? What,
The interior was
wallpaper? Wood.
California laurel. All the descriptions are California laurel. I've tried to find a dendrochronologist to look at that and really confirm that what I'm looking at in there is laurel. I've never been successful in finding anybody, and I don't want to cut a big piece out to send off to the National Lab to really get a definitive answer. Laurel was a big thing in California. They were, I think Billy Ralston had a lot to do with trying to promote local industries, like Kimball Car Works and some of the things. And one of the things they were always ballyhooing was building furniture out of laurel. And then you look at the papers, within a few years, they're talking about the bug that's eaten all the laurel wood. But there are descriptions of really big sticks of laurel, like 36 by 36 inches by 50 or 60 feet long. Big blocks of wood. And that stuff's gone. There just wasn't the forest to match it. There are pieces of wood in there that I think would be really hard to find if you were shopping for lumber today. Just the quality of the redwood.
Well, it's all old growth. That's pretty much gone.
If I remember right, California laurel, it's illegal to cut it.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Really?
Nowadays they
You're
call
not
it
supposed
myrtlewood.
to take any of it out of the whatever's left of the forest up north.
Yeah, I don't know how much, but there are big sticks of it in the paper. They talk about going to Mare Island and using it. But anyway,
Right in the 60s, it was a really big thing.
yeah. Sort of like around the turn of the century, we're gonna make a killing raising eucalyptus. You know, that didn't last very long. It got hard awful fast. Anyway, enjoy.
That's like the last time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And you sent samples.
Somebody told me that there's an article. There was an article on it.
As an aside on that, I think it's legal to cut laurel in Oregon, but not in California.
Well, it's an understory tree.
It's an understory tree.
It's not a dominant tree in the forest.
I mean, historians can say it should be 1869, and we just go through the process.
This car was that product. Yeah, I heard that. We were just talking about
The axle sweeps every time it rotates.
So it has lubrication as it goes around.
Thank you for finding that, knowing where it was. And there it says V&T on it. So they stamped it. So they made that change.
Yeah,
That
this
was
is a
that
casting,
original.
so probably at some time the trucks were damaged and the V&T had to cast new parts.
So that's a piece of wood there behind it, right?
Yeah, this is a wooden beam.
And that's redwood?
Top is wood.
That's redwood?
Probably not. Redwood's not very strong.
That's probably oak.
Probably
Yeah,
oak.
redwood's soft.
Did you get a picture of it? It's really neat.
No, I wanted to feel the end of the axle.
And the new cells.
But there's literally
that's oak.
V&T written on that,
Yeah.
the chevron
Yeah,
kicks in. That's sort of
cast
a
in.
neat, that's rather a neat a shot of that. You can stand over here if you want.
I got it.
Neil, why is this with crack already?
Well, it was probably green wood when they built it, and as it dried, it cracked.
Okay, so this is not a new piece. This is
This is
So there's wood underneath. So where's the trestle?
They're right across and up there. They're very nice.
One of them blew the boiler.